Well, what a week for the world. The erupting conflict in the Middle East, images of brutality and destruction, the huge cost of human life, destroyed buildings, livelihoods. Another terrible earthquake in Afghanistan, people with very little left with even less. Many lives lost, and yet we hardly hear about it with higher priority news stories. Closer to home, the elections, the results, well, they're pretty clear, but there will be some ongoing negotiations. The gospel today follows on from the parable of the tenants that Linda preached about last week. This parable of the wedding banquet includes allegory and analogy that can be seen as dividing people into groups of good and bad. And it seems very dangerous to go down that road. Politically in Aotearoa, New Zealand, globally in the Middle East, Russia and the Ukraine, other places of conflict, we risk continuing stereotypes, misinformation and generalizations. Everything is so complicated, it's hard to discern the truth. Who is right? Who is wrong? Can we even define truth with a capital T? And why are some so focused on who will be welcomed in and who will be cast out? In all the unrest in our troubled world, we know that it is the innocent who suffer. Innocent civilians, innocent children. Killed and injured, made homeless through no fault of their own. Now, I don't know about you, but I sometimes feel overwhelmed with the enormity of the issues in the world and indeed sometimes in our own lives. There is a sense that tension is building in all sorts of ways and places. But what grounds me, what spoke to me when I read this gospel passage and the commentaries around it, is the centrality of what we will do today, what we do each Sunday. For I'm a person who loves the sacraments, and the sacrament we celebrate today is the sacrament of Holy Communion. The Eucharist is the sacrament commemorating the action of Jesus at the Last Supper. And in the Eucharist, we are immersed in the hospitality of God, who is both the host and the meal. In Eucharist here in this place, we allow all who want to partake. The Eucharist offers a merciful and compassionate space for all who choose to encounter God. And yet, in our not too recent history, people were excluded. It was a narrow space. Children were excluded. Divorced people were excluded. Queers were excluded. How can we put aside the misconceptions and fears of the other that leads us to whittle down the inclusion of all? I believe that consciously or unconsciously, we put limitations on others due to cultural or religious norms, and even sometimes because of our liberal values as well as some who hold conservative values. In that psalm we said together today, so familiar, Psalm 23, the table is laid before God's beloved, while the enemies are outside observers. Jesus, of course, came and expanded that image, love your enemies. And in the Eucharist, God is providing sustenance necessary for life, for all who come, all who want to receive. I remember a few years ago in another church in another city where a well-meaning welcomer asked a young man to take off his cap as he walked into the church. The youngster turned around and walked out. Yes, I know about customs and I know about respect, and yet wasn't that an opportunity lost? As a church, we are to extend hospitality to those who are like and unlike us, by providing space for them to encounter and experience God's unrelenting mercy, God's unrelenting compassion. And too often we want the soft side, the safe side, the following of Christ, which doesn't ask that much of us. And we shy away from that more difficult work that asks us to change: social justice, outreach. We want peace on earth, but we don't necessarily want to work towards that end if it means change for us, our lives, our actions. You see, sometimes I think we do turn down the invitation. Others are invited in our place. We want to be at the wedding banquet, but we're not always dressed in an acceptable way. In this parable, that bit about the unrobed guest, perhaps it's saying that they do not show the fruits of living as a guest of the banquet of grace. When the host asks them to account for the way they appear, he has nothing to say. This parable of the wedding banquet invites us to reflect on the grace of election. All were invited, and the obligations of obedience to be clothed with Christ, to live with Christ. Though many are chosen, all are welcome. Actually living out the gospel, being clothed in the right way, is not easy. Just last Friday, sitting in my office, I could hear very loudly through the speakers Brian Tamaki and his followers as they marched up Queen Street, waving the Israeli flag. Christians for Israel, they said. Blaring from the speakers as part of a speech was, "He is a God who loves Israel." And in my office I couldn't stop myself but say, "But she is a God who loves Palestine." And there was a counter-march by Palestinian supporters yesterday. As we think of the atrocities in the Middle East, we can be quick to offer an opinion, even take a side, yet how can we make a real difference? Apart, of course, from praying. And yet, closer to home, we can make our choices. In our daily interactions, we make choices, whether we act with compassion, with kindness, with humility, meekness and patience, with those in our own families, in our workplaces, our schools, our cities, our nation. I want to conclude with a prayer from a Palestinian Christian, and it's recorded in St. George's Cathedral in Jerusalem. Pray not for Arab or Jew, for Palestinian or Israeli, but pray rather for ourselves, that we might not divide them in our prayers, but keep them both together in our hearts. Amen.